Bang goes the dynamite on the Space Coast as Blue Origin blows up a New Glenn booster during a static test fire. The largest man-made non-nuclear explosion in history is an unfortunate setback for Blue Origin as their last rocket failed to deliver AST's Bluebird to orbit. And this will set back their Amazon Leo deployment even further.
Get your wallets ready because JPL is up for sale. The stalwart research institution of NASA is looking for a new manager for the first time since its founding as the shakeups at NASA continue. JPL's bidding rights will no longer be exclusive to Caltech, so for the first time in its history, JPL is hitting the open market. When asked for comment, Bernoulli the Beaver responded, anywhere but MIT.
SpaceX is raking in the dough as it ramps up for its IPO. This week, it landed $6 billion in government contracts, about half its yearly income from space, and about 1/300th of its planned valuation for going public. After reports that third-party investment experts advised SpaceX to lower their IPO's target valuation, an additional 50% of last 12 months' revenue may help to justify the ambitious PE ratio among retail and institutional investors.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer,
here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal.
Our main topics this week include rockets, ground, and SpaceX taking up a whole section for themselves this week. On the rocket side of things, we have big news because there was a big explosion in Florida. New Glenn was ready to launch their NG-4 rocket as soon as they cleared FAA investigation for the NG-3 failure. So they were testing out NG-4 on the static test fire stand, and it did not go off without a hitch. It instead exploded. Very unfortunate for New Glenn. Somewhat fortunately, the 24 Amazon Leo satellites that were intended to launch on that vehicle are not already integrated. So what they really lost was the booster and probably a whole lot of time. This will surely trigger an FAA investigation. No doubt in my mind. There's no way around that. And it will also force them to rebuild their launch pad. Now, this happened at Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral. And when we say big explosion, this was big. It knocked out one of the lightning towers. Somehow the other one managed to stay up. It was seen, I'm sure it was seen from space, but there was video of it being seen from up and down the whole East Coast, lighting up the sky.
Yeah.
And
mid-afternoon at 10 p.m. in Cape Canaveral.
And so, Blue Origin is working on standing up other launch pads, but they don't have any active right now. They might be able to get one of them online by the time the FAA clears their investigation, but it's going to take some time for them to rebuild Launch Complex 36. So on multiple fronts, they're going to be delayed. This is not good for their rocket program in general, but it's even worse for their Amazon Leo program since they've been racing to get another 1,000 satellites up by end of July to meet their FCC deadline. This is just throwing another wrench in the works there. There's other satellites they're planning to launch, I think AST is still planning to launch on them. So this is a further delay for their customers, which is not great there. Although they did win a national security launch a few hours before this thing blew up. And there was comment afterwards that no, we're still going to launch with them. So, hopefully they don't lose any customers from this, but it's a definite setback. A lot of support in the industry for them, just saying they'll learn from this, they'll bounce back. It's great to see our industry supporting people through such hard times. But I share in that sentiment. I'm sure Blue Origin will learn from this and come back better than ever. It's just unfortunate that this happened.
Yeah.
Luckily, no one was hurt too. That's important to note.
That's probably the most important thing to note.
Yeah.
The reality of the situation is that whether or not this was a small explosion or the biggest non-nuclear explosion in history kind of doesn't matter. The outcome is still effectively the same for the company. So you're absolutely right. There's going to be an additional FAA investigation. This is 2 effectively failed launches, though this was during a static test, not actually a launch, but two rocket failures back to back. So, whatever that previous sort of delay was after the Bluebird 6 mishap, this delay will undoubtedly be longer. So biggest cost to Blue Origin is undoubtedly going to be timeline. And I couldn't agree with you more there. But, they will undoubtedly learn from this. And, it is good to see the industry still sort of providing support and not withdrawing from Blue Origin. I'm encouraged to hear that despite the fact that the contractors awarded mere hours before the event, that folks aren't trying to sort of retroactively invalidate or annul the contract. So glad to hear that Blue Origin is still sort of getting the industry support that they need. At the same time, there's some sort of challenges with that, like, launch is really hard. And so in order to increase our national launch cadence and our national launch inventory, this is sort of what we need to do, is to everybody sort of stand behind the folks who are trying and working really hard to do this. At the same time, that's pretty antithetical to the nature of sort of a free and open market. So, there's some challenges with getting the folks to effectively overcome and do the impossible thing, while still allowing for sort of true sort of unbiased markets to happen here. So, I'm of the opinion that it's still a good thing to have more launch providers, and Blue Origin is the closest we have to competing with SpaceX in that capacity. So I very much want to see them get sort of the support that they need to succeed here. But that is sort of the trade-off that we play here, is that there's going to be a little bit of royalty making that sort of has to happen, because there needs to be sort of government support for such a capital intensive and for such a technologically demanding industry.
On the Australian side of the launch vehicle market, Gilmore Space has raised another $14.2 million. This money came from the Australian Retirement Trust, which brings their Series E up to $231.2 million. Although when they were asked for comment, the CEO was not clear on whether he was considering this a Series F or a Series E, given that their Series E was targeted for $150 million, and they reached that pretty quickly back in January, actually. So this extension comes a bit later. And it sounds like they might just be, either breaking out the extra $100 million into a Series F and potentially considering raising more money, given the markets are really hot right now, or if they're just considering this one mega raise for their Series E. This will help accelerate their timeline to launch a couple more rockets that they have on the docket. Their last launch was in July of last year, and it lasted for about 14 seconds before it blew up in a much less spectacular fashion than New Glenn. But still, unfortunate setback for any rocket company to have their rocket explode, given that it's like their second launch, it's kind of to be expected. So they remain confident that in the next two launches, they'll successfully reach orbit, and that this amount of money is enough to get them through those launches comfortably. So great to see. Australia doesn't have a launch capacity yet. They have some great space capabilities that they've been standing up recently. Southern Reach landing site is one of the most active components of their space industry, although they also have a lot of useful ground stations for some Chinese monitoring on the government side of things, and they have their dark radar stations to track space objects. So Australia has a strong background in space development, but getting their own launch capability will be a huge boon towards standing up their own satellite capabilities and sovereign space capabilities. So it's great to see Gilmore having a lot of traction here. They have a pretty impressive rocket for kind of the debut of the launch industry for a country. And yeah, great to hear that they think this is enough money to kind of get them to successful launch cadence.
Wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think Gilmore Space really has their work cut out for them if they're trying to keep up with some of the displays we've seen over the last week, like with New Glenn here. But another good chunk of change to Gilmore, helping them to rapidly mature their rockets and achieve sort of space sovereignty for Australia, I think is a net positive. So glad to see the money coming in there. whether or not they'll want to break it out to a Series F or continue to expand and extend their Series E basically is going to boil down to whether, I mean, it's basically going to boil down to the terms and effectively what expanding the oversubscribed Series E looks like versus breaking out into a Series F. If you break it out to a Series F, that means that you're able to effectively break money out into a separate sort of term sheet at a separate valuation. So you're able to look at less dilution effectively. The hassle of doing so is that you do have to create that entire new vehicle. There's a lot of sort of marginal cost in the sense that there's a lot of paperwork that goes into that. But basically it's going to boil down to whether or not it is more dilutive to the investors currently on the cap table and whether they'd be able to get sort of a term sheet that lines up with everything, and whether or not that's actually easier on sort of their utility curve, so to speak. But whether or not, getting that additional, we're going to avoid, 0.5% of dilution, and all it's going to take is, a 2-week sprint of sleepless nights and 100-hour work weeks. Whether or not that 0.5% of dilution or whatever the numbers wind up being is ultimately worth it to everybody. That's sort of where the decision tree for whether or not to just extend and expand their Series E or to break this off into a Series F is worth it.
Voyager this week was awarded a $16.5 million contract by the DARPA Burn and Go program. This is to make post-manufacturing thrust controls for solid rockets. So Voyager last year bought ST's Energetics, solid rocket manufacturer. And this contract is to kind of use that technology to develop something for solid rocket motors that allows them to kind of monitor their performance during flight and do some thrust control capabilities, which, addresses two of the core risks with solid rocket motors. One is that, they're kind of dangerous once you burn them. If something goes wrong, it's hard to abort or, sense if something's going wrong. Having sensors in there should help, with that capability, and having thrust controls is the other one, because a solid rocket, you can't, throttle it up and down. There's no throttle ability to it. So having some level of control there is a pretty unique capability. Both of those, at this level of contract is basically to develop a prototype that can show they're capable of this, but it looks like it's going to flow into larger contracts for solid rocket motors for missile defense capabilities, which is where a lot of this market goes towards, and where we've been seeing a lot of money flow into over the past year. We talk a lot about, Avio and Lockheed and Raytheon working on solid rockets and spending hundreds of millions of dollars, especially given the conflicts around the world. So this is a hot market for Voyager to play a role in. Voyager, we talked about them last week when Vast did their pivot. Voyager is one of the few companies working on a commercial space station. That seems to be one of their kind of hallmark projects. But like Redwire, they provide components to a number of different programs up and down kind of the vertical stack. So this is a great diversification of their business model. Last week we talked about them supplying sensors to the Otter mission that Redwire is performing with DARPA. So this is the second DARPA contract in a row, week after week, which is, great. It's great forward-facing momentum for Voyager, because usually DARPA projects are kind of ahead of the curve, developing new technology. They lead to capabilities that scale up more for full-fledged contracts. So Voyager planting a lot of seeds here that hopefully pay off in just in these past 2 weeks, a couple of industries that have huge upside potential. So great to see Voyager playing in multiple different domains. That should help bring in the money that hopefully funds their Starlab efforts to build out a space station, since it seems that there's not a lot of money to be made there as of recent, or ever by our judgment.
The commercial space stations to high-powered buses that we discussed last week coming out of Vast Space, I'm not surprised to see Voyager doing something similar. So, Voyager is they're one of the folks behind Starlab, like you mentioned, which is sort of one of the other contemporaries to Vast Space's commercial space station. though they do more than just that. So I'm not surprised to see them, quote unquote, sort of diversifying a little bit, but in so many words, I'm not surprised to see them getting out of that commercial space station market. The idea of sort of diversifying one's technological capabilities fundamentally is like, I don't like that, but the idea of in-housing and sort of defending one's technological moat, I do. So point being that, like, we see Rocket Lab and York Space buying up folks outside of their core, but the folks that they're buying up are their key inputs to their end products. So all of this to say that, like, there's reason to like Voyager continuing to win DARPA contracts and continuing to sort of develop and provide additional technological products and additional technological solutions. The idea of sort of developing a core product offering and remaining focused on that core product offering is one of the things that specifically in aerospace is really hard to see folks, I'll say, remain disciplined about, because space is so technologically demanding, because there are so many different, for lack of a better term, so many rabbit holes that go into it. You can find basically anything that you can find any number of different areas to get smarter on, or to get more qualified on, or to somehow build out additional technological differentiation or capability on. But all of this to say that, like, I like the idea that Voyager is continuing to win additional DARPA contracts. That's a good sign. DARPA is very much sort of on the cutting edge. They're not a research institution, but like they're a little bit more on the research side than they are on
research in their name, though.
Right, but like, they're not they're not JPL, right? Like they're much more sort of I'll say like applied research than like pure exploratory research.
Yeah.
But like, I like the idea of Voyager continuing to make progress here. I do worry a little bit that Voyager is I do worry a little bit for Voyager that their sort of core product offering, their core competency, their core capabilities are a little bit muddled, and that they are a little bit more of like not that this is a bad thing, but so like that they are a little bit more of like a red wire in the space of somebody who's got sort of like their fingers sort of in every pie, able to sort of participate in everything. And like, having spoken with some of the folks at Redwire, their approach is a little bit of like, well, we sort of keep a finger in every pie so that we can remain one of the top 3 players in every pie. But they're just sort of like catching and killing at that stage. So like it works, it can work. It's that business model is net a little bit. It's a little bit like value, not like destroying, but there are other business models that would allow for more innovation and more value to be added to the space industry.
I think it makes a lot of sense short term, as the space industry is still maturing and exploring new technologies, and they're kind of waiting to see where to place their big bet. But long term, I think they need to find something to focus on and specialize that. On the space side of rockets, we have an interesting announcement out of Italy. A company called Stellar Alpina. Alpina? I don't know. Do you know Italian?
No le comprendere.
Yeah. I thought there's another company called Stellare, Officina Stellare, so I'm kind of surprised it's not Stellare Alpina. Anyway, Stellar Alpina, they raised $4.5 million for their on-orbit rotating detonation rocket engine. And in a moment of prescience on our part, we released our coverage of Juno Propulsion an hour before they made this announcement. You should go check out that article. We covered it on last week's podcast. Hopefully you caught that. We also have the full interview with Juno Propulsion CEO, Dr. Alexis Haroon, on our YouTube. And check out Spacetime's pod for our article covering their rotating detonation rocket engine, where I claimed it was the only in-space rotating detonation rocket engine company because at the time it was, and as of release, it is no longer. This is a very rare technology. There are not very many companies playing in this. Yeah, I compared their technology to JAXA because they're really the only other ones I've technically launched one to space. So to give a bit of a brief, like rotating detonation rocket engine is a technology that's different from combustion rocket, different from conflagration rocket engines where you just burn the fuel. Instead, here you blow it up to get more efficiency. So you're not ejecting unburned fuel and you get more thrust out of that, more fuel efficiency. Most of the companies pursuing this have been pursuing it for hypersonics and missile testing. So companies like Raytheon, like General Electric, like Venus Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney have been partnered with Raytheon through DARPA. They're all working on rockets and launch vehicles. So there are very few that have proposed this for space technology. But as the need for space mobility increases, both for defense purposes and interplanetary travel, this technology is kind of getting looked at again. Juno Propulsion is launching theirs next year, so it'll be interesting to see if they are technically the first ones to operate on orbit with a RDRE, or if this funding for Stellar Alpina will get them to orbit first. It's great to see in either case. I think it's a cool technology. I think it's one of the few technologies that can leapfrog current specific impulse for on-orbit thrusters. I think it makes a lot of sense for things like defense satellites, space-based interceptors, and lunar orbiting, since we saw all of the lunar contracts that went out for LLO. Satellites have some component of chemical thrusters, so there's a lot of benefits to using this technology in terms of just moving faster, being able to use different fuels, integrating well with the infrastructure that's being stood up for persistent and reactive space capabilities. So happy to see that Stellar Alpina is entering the competition there.
So as we discussed in the intro here, NASA is about to open the management contract for JPL to an open competition. JPL has been managed solely by Caltech since the transfer of ownership from the Army to NASA in 1958. And the cited sort of reason and justification for opening it up to competitive contracting has been effectively the rapid growth of the space economy. And under Isaacman, NASA wants to explore the market for other competitive opportunities. It's hard not to read a little bit of politics into this, but this effectively represents one of the concerns that I had about Isaacman's tenure as NASA administrator. Isaacman comes from a background in business, not a background in space or a background in research. And the sort of the TLDR is that through exploratory R&D, not necessarily the DARPA stage of research, but true exploratory R&D is simply not commercially profitable. It's just not a commercially viable business model. And so taking a federally funded research and development center from a university, which is effectively run and optimized around research, it's not run for profit, it's not a business model, but taking it from a university, putting it in the hands of a for-profit entity that represents sort of a pretty big mismatch effectively between the sort of the core competencies of JPL, the way that JPL has been sort of optimized and run for the last 70 some odd years, or 68 years, and the way that sort of effectively new management would run it. So it would likely lead to a lot of, quote, sort of fiscally responsible decisions that are largely counterproductive for the quality and quantity of research that's being conducted. And so this basically boils down to Isaacman was very pro sort of public-private partnership. And he was really sort of pushing for those changes in his candidacy for administrator. And so one of the concerns for that would mean, rather than sort of a public-private partnership, that it would look a little bit more like the privatization of what has otherwise been some sort of publicly owned and publicly run stuff here a little bit. And that's, in so many words, that's sort of what the concern is. Like, hey, okay, we're opening this up for new management company. Like, I think this will go to SpaceX over UCLA or USC. I think this will go to a for-profit business entity rather than a tried and true research institution, which is I would argue that's a net negative for the space industry. So, a little bit disappointing to see that, but the concern is fundamentally that sort of a change in management will lead to JPL being treated as a revenue generating or profit generating entity rather than a true sort of research and development entity. Accountability is always a good thing, but I think that some of the incentives and goals here might be a little bit misaligned, which is a bummer.
Yeah, I was not a fan of this announcement either. I think, Caltech's done a great job over the past, 70 years now.
68, yeah.
It's
nice.
a great run. And technically, this announcement doesn't take them out of the running. They could potentially win it again. Although, yeah, reading the tea leaves like you did, it seems like they're trying to get them out of the loop there and get some money into the private sector, which I totally agree. Like, this case has been made to death that, like, the government is good at one-off, like, big, exquisite projects that just don't make money. Like, James Webb wouldn't make any money in the commercial sector. No. And I would be hard pressed to believe if a company could have managed that project better. It was already a challenging project. I think they did the best they could. And that's kind of the case with all their space missions. I honestly don't see like why a company would want to manage this other than just having a potential slush fund or funneling project contracts over to themselves. So in that sense, like Northrop Grumman makes the most sense because they do a lot of James Webb was built by them. They're involved in a lot of different space contracts. They do have great systems engineering capability. Like they're one of the few primes that didn't have to buy out a space systems company 10 years ago to kind of develop that core competency. And maybe in my mind, that's like the best case scenario, because hearing that like Boeing takes over JPL would just be like a nail in the coffin in my mind. Like, this is not an ideal outcome. SpaceX would be kind of cool, but like it almost seems redundant. And again, like just a way for them to funnel money into their programs. And not really fitting with like, they want to go to the moon and Mars. They're just going to not have any focus on like space science. So I don't know. In my mind, like I wish it would just stay with Caltech. I could see Aerospace Corporation being one of the lead contenders for this. They are a private company, but they have a strong competency in program management and some of these like non-commercial kind of space projects. And they're in the area, like right next to them. They've had a long partnership with them. But definitely going to be keeping an eye on how this progresses, seeing who kind of throws their hat in the ring and where the winds push this sail.
Yeah, I would be, if we're right that this is going to wind up being an effort by private industry to basically just buy JPL. I would be very surprised if Intuitive Machines didn't try and position themselves as one of the front runners, given how focused they are on the moon, given JPL's sort of inarguable place in history with the Apollo programs, with the Mercury programs, with everything that needed to happen for the lunar missions. I wouldn't be surprised if it winds up going to Intuitive Machines, or if they or any of the major contract winners for some of the moon base, some of the moon base contracts wind up being sort of the front runners for something like this. But I think in my mind, like worst case scenario would be this goes to one of the management of JPL winds up going to one of the big primes, and at this point, I would include SpaceX in that. And winds up just sort of being used as a contract mill or a slush fund to further their own sort of business goals. But I would love to be proven wrong.
I would love if you were right. And it's Intuitive Machine. Well, and maybe not love, but like probably one of the better outcomes there.
I had a feeling you would. A little bit further north, our neighbors in Canada have started a consortium led by Nord Space that was awarded $3.2 million for the next generation additive manufacturing of space propulsion. The way to properly read this is that the consortium of Nord Space, Milterra Machining, Pegmatis, and Prime Powders are all working together to create basically what amounts to an AI-enabled factory. And so they're not looking at doing sort of in-space additive manufacturing here. This is both additive and subtractive manufacturing. They're going to be using both laser sinters and CNC machines. The key thing here is that this is an AI-enabled machine shop, an AI-enabled factory. And so the contract award is effectively, it's in direct service of the defense industrial strategy that Canada's Ministry of Defense released earlier in February, onshoring sort of the entirety of their space manufacturing and space operational capabilities to achieve sort of full stack sovereignty for national security. But so this is interesting to see. I know there's been, I'll say, decades long sort of push to this amorphous factory of the future. I'm excited to sort of see that play out in the space industry. And it'll be interesting to see what that actually entails. But in my mind, they're going to be leveraging a lot of advanced robotics. They're going to be leveraging a lot of sort of machine learning and computer vision to try and sort of streamline and improve the cycle time for a lot of the manufacturing needs that they already have, rather than sort of applying this rapid manufacturing capability to novel stuff that they don't already know how to do blindfolded. Similarly, in Europe, there is another partnership that was announced this year with the goal of standing up, I'll say, sovereign space capabilities end to end by the end of the decade. This partnership between Schaeffler AG and Spire, that was announced earlier this week. So the partnership leverages Spire's space expertise with Schaeffler's manufacturing at scale capability. Schaeffler does not have any space expertise, but they do big picture, massive manufacturing at scale. So the MOU was sort of announced this week. Their goal is to stand up full spectrum capabilities by the end of the decade, which is a pretty ambitious timeline. 3.5 years to be able to do this stuff end to end. Pretty darn ambitious. And as I've said a couple of times, like, these joint ventures, these partnerships between private companies usually do not last long. So the way that I'm immediately sort of looking at this is like, okay, great. Is Schaeffler teaching Spire how to manufacture at scale, or is Spire teaching Schaeffler how to do space manufacturing? Regardless, the way that the sort of, I'll say, net expertise is flowing, the company that is net sharing more expertise is effectively sort of working themselves out of a job in this relationship, right? If Spire winds up teaching Schaeffler everything that they want to know about space, Schaeffler is going to be able to, by the end of the decade, sort of stand this up and then go off and do everything themselves. And similarly, if Schaeffler winds up teaching Spire all about manufacturing at scale, then Spire would be able to go off and do all of this themselves and cut Schaeffler out of it. So whether or not that's actually their goal, whether or not they actually do want to stand up and build out that sort of core competency, that's a whole separate question. But the way that these sort of partnerships end up working is when you stand up a completely separate entity, and then Schaeffler and Spire would end up holding equity in that completely separate entity. So we'll see if that's what happens. This is still very early on. It's just an MOU sign, so nothing has actually been contributed towards this yet. But if their goal is to stand up full manufacturing capability by the end of the decade, they got to hit the ground running here. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not they try to do this between the two of them, and the belief is just like, well, space is going to be too hard for them to stand up, and manufacturing at scale is going to be too hard for the other party to stand up. So it'll be fine. We'll just sort of work together and see if we're able to win some big contracts here, and then we can play it by ear moving forward.
Yeah, I read it kind of differently. I felt like it was playing into the manufacturing bottleneck aspect of the space industry of, space is starting to reach scales that require more automatable capability for manufacturing to reach the number of satellites that is needed to deploy some of these proliferated constellations and larger scale programs. Like Spire's already been manufacturing in Europe for about a year now. They're at 300 to 400 satellite scale. So a lot of this is just building deeper ties with European countries to capitalize on that space sovereignty aspect that's been so hot recently. Primarily, probably just to get the money from European countries that want to rapidly deploy constellations. But, I guess what I was seeing more so is like if they've been at this for a year and they've established ties to Europe through that, and I know they have a number of programs with European countries to build out satellite buses, they're basically seeing a supply or a demand signal that's going to need an adequate supply response. And if they're able to do the hundreds scale manufacturing, maybe reaching thousands scale manufacturing requires a bit of extra expertise. What I would kind of hope to come out of this is that there's some sort of European sovereign capability to stand up rapid manufacturing, ideally not just in Germany, but throughout the European nations, because this is a capability that's being pursued heavily in the US, but I think across the industry and the defense industry as well, of being able to rapidly stand up manufacturing for large scale production. It's something we've seen for like drone manufacturing, missile manufacturing. I think it's starting to arrive at the space manufacturing side of things. And being able to figure that out in a scalable way has huge value. So I think, in my mind, the ideal outcome of this is that together they come up with some sort of product or service that enables any satellite manufacturer to scale their operations on demand. We've seen this with a few companies recently, like Hadrian. Again, they play in the defense sector mainly, but what they're proposing works well for the space sector. And I think just given that, space sovereignty in Europe is signaling that there's going to be a rapidly growing demand, I think capabilities like this are necessary. I think it's, something we're seeing more often. Consortiums stood up because we had that UASat in Ukraine. We had the Polish one. We had that big Rheinmetall ISI joint venture. So this is a very popular way to go about kind of distributing and advancing technology for European space capabilities.
Observable Space has announced a $90 million Series A and a $94 million Space Force contract, basically simultaneously. So, congrats to them on the effective $180 million StratFi, with $90 million in government funding and then matched private funding. But what I thought was really interesting about this is that the Series A, led by Lux Capital, is focused on their in-space systems. The money that they're going to be using from this Series A is to accelerate some of their partnerships, so effectively sales, to develop their in-space systems and to expand internal operations. So what they're doing is they're growing the team, they're focusing on sales and business dev, and they're developing their space-based components. Whereas the Space Force contract is exclusively to deliver on ground station capabilities. So interesting to see equivalent amounts of money coming in for not completely separate, but for two fairly distinct capabilities and product offerings.
It's a big amount of money, but it's for a technology that we've seen a lot of demand for recently. It's been interesting to follow the ground side of this sort of technology, as it's a capability that's functional but hasn't been able to reach deployment scale yet. We interviewed Open Cosmos CEO Rafael Jorda-Sikir a couple months ago, and he was talking about how they had actually accomplished this through their partnership with TSAT. So there is some capability already to do this, but it sounded like from his experience that it's just not stable enough. The cloud cover is an issue. You can't reliably get down the data you need and the times you need. it's, not something they're giving up on, but it's definitely got a longer kind of rollout timeline than we've seen for space to space laser communication. So it's always great to see companies tackling this problem. We interviewed Azora Space CEO James Galkovic about a month ago. I thought their solution was very creative, just deploy a bunch of these, make them small enough that you can deploy hundreds around the world so that, cloud cover no longer becomes an issue. It looks like observable space. It might take a similar approach, although their tech looks a bit bigger. So it might be like trying to produce enough power to punch through the clouds in that sense. But I think it's also a benefit to them to have both sides of the equation, to have a more integrated system that could, if you need to change something in the tech to kind of get around some of the problems of going through the atmosphere, you have control over both sides of it. And it also allows them to bring in money like through this contract, through the more mature space-to-space communication layer to then fund the ground communication layer. So I think this is a great approach from them, and I think that the funding and contract reflect that.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning also the fact that like one of the big gaps that we sort of identified in the overall sort of space market was specifically in the US's ground station segment. That, when we were first starting here, there was a lot to be said about how the US lagged behind Europe and more broadly sort of the global ground station capabilities, and that there was a lot of consolidation and a lot of investment outside of the US into that asset class. And it's interesting to me. Like, it's interesting to me to see how much money has been thrown at solving exactly that problem over the last like 6 months, because there has been a lot. So this is very much something that the U.S. government has decided to just sort of buy, and to buy that solution when we get there. And it looks very much like we're at that sort of decision point. So, wholeheartedly agree with you that the sort of intersatellite link, the space-based assets of this is still one of the key sort of stated bottlenecks and one of the key problems that needs to be solved. But it's great to see observable space getting money for the current status of their ground stations, and knowing that they will continue to sort of build out and develop the orbital segment as well.
So on to SpaceX this week, they had a number of interesting news coming out of just one company. I thought most of the stuff in the lead up to the IPO would just be financial news, but this week we had a number of contracts, a number of announcements, a number of shifts in kind of the the kind of work that they're doing. The big headliner for this week was a pair of contracts that total $6 billion, which is a huge amount of money, especially now that we know how much revenue SpaceX makes. Is about like half of their annual revenue from space operations already. Granted, these contracts will be drawn out over probably a number of years, although maybe not as much as I would expect, given that both of them are leveraging capability that SpaceX already has. The first one being that SpaceX won $2.29 billion for their space defense network. This is something we touched on a couple of weeks ago when the PWSA Tranche 3 was kind of decommissioned in a way, or kind of broken up into pieces. They got rid of the communication layer and focused more on the missile tracking layer. And that came along with the SDA restructuring under Space Force. So this is, following on to that, this is the actual contract number attached to how much that's worth to the Space Force and how much they're paying SpaceX to develop this. So that will be using their Starshield capability to provide a network communication system, both for ground communications, military communications, but the primary focus is for space communications and control and command to missile defense capabilities on the Earth. So this is a layer that we've seen in every layer of proliferated warfighter space architecture, of that you need rapid space-to-space communications in order to move tracking data of satellites that can detect the missile to command centers on the ground that can then fire an interceptor to stop that missile. So this is a key component to U.S. missile defense capabilities, and a large price tag attached to that for rolling out technology that basically leverages Starlink, but in a more secure fashion. To kind of go along with that, SpaceX was also awarded $4.16 billion for the space-based moving target identification system. This is playing into the other side of that equation, which I did, there weren't inklings of weeks ago. But basically, this is to fund missile tracking capability from SpaceX. So, like I said, proliferated warfighter space architecture has a couple of main components. One is the ability to find or to detect a missile and track it, and the other is to communicate that to the stations that can defend against it. SDN gives them the communication layer. This contract gives them the identification layer. Really interesting because SpaceX does not work on Earth observation satellites. They could do some radar stuff that's not too far outside of the wheelhouse of just radio communications. But overall, this is a pretty major shift from the sort of space assets that they've traditionally done. The $2 billion for Starshield is basically an expansion upon their communications business. And I would immediately attribute that to that, column of their revenue that they list down their IPO. But this $4 billion is for a kind of completely new sector of revenue, which I'm kind of surprised they didn't specifically call out in their IPO, because they kind of broke it down by launch, communications, and all their AI stuff. But this plays into just general like space capabilities and is kind of a harbinger of future work to come. And I think the price tag's a bit higher because they would need to develop new technology in order to accomplish this, whereas the SDN is just leveraging Starlink capability that they're already investing in, are already deploying and developing.
Yeah, like asset tracking for aircraft, spacecraft, and blanking on the terminology here, but like tracking planes, trains, automobiles, and in this case also sort of missiles. That is something that we're expecting to sort of grow and continue to become important. So like seeing this play out for sort of aircraft, I would not at all be surprised to see like more contracts and like more prioritization going and coming from sort of defense contractors looking for tracking of sort of a wider variety of assets. I wouldn't imagine we would see this for like terrestrial use just yet, meaning like, vehicles or infantry. Like I wouldn't expect to see anything like that. I'd think sort of your standard Earth observation has that pretty well covered. But one of the big sort of priorities of Golden Dome was like the missile alert, missile tracking, using sort of infrared to sort of check and track a lot of this. So there's been a lot of conversations and in different levels of a lot of sort of publicly available conversations in that vein as well. So I would not at all be surprised to see aircraft tracking sort of serve as one of the I'll say canaries for some big contracts following in more defense related applications as well.
Yeah, there will likely be follow-on contracts to this. This is a big number for like the initial contract, but given SpaceX's track record and the fact that like Starshield's already developed, I'm sure they'll execute on this well. And Golden Dome has like a $1.2 trillion total projected contract budget. So as they deploy this, I'm sure more contracts will follow to kind of expand that deployment. So this is shaping up to be a lucrative business line for SpaceX, and kind of surprising given they didn't bid on and they weren't really involved in any of the contracts for PWSA. So this is almost coming out of nowhere as a shift from the Space Force away from this kind of diversified crowd of space companies towards one of the biggest, like most non-prime space companies out there. And another expansion to their business, the Starfall project has passed through FAA environmental screening. So the FAA has approved SpaceX to deorbit 2 Starfall spacecrafts into the Pacific Ocean to test this system. Starfall is a project that's been in the works for a couple of years, pretty under the covers for SpaceX. They haven't talked about it a lot, but it is a in-space manufacturing platform that basically leverages their Dragon capsule technology to provide deorbitable satellites that can be deployed by the Falcon 9 or Starship, manufacture on orbit, and then come back down to Earth and be retrieved. These are very impressive satellites, 3 meters in diameter. They can carry a literal ton of payload material. And their filings are talking about, deploying tens, hundreds of these, having them deorbit, land with parachutes and be retrieved by boats, which SpaceX is also experienced with boat retrieval. So this is leveraging a lot of strengths that SpaceX has already developed and playing into a sector that's fairly young. There's companies that are looking to do this for in-space manufacturing. There's plenty of those. There's also newer companies that are looking into like point-to-point transport, which I've also found kind of interesting, given that part of the Starfall filing talks about being able to deploy resources to different locations on Earth. So something similar to what Inversion's working on with on-orbit stowed cargo that can be deorbited to a place kind of on demand. This would provide a really interesting capability for SpaceX, given that in their S1 filing, they noted that they were still considering point-to-point transport as part of their rocket program, which, to make that clear, is using a rocket to fly somebody from like LA to Tokyo, using rockets as planes. It's not been a very useful kind of business line. Nobody really has gotten there. I think the safety and economics of it don't make a whole lot of sense, but for cargo transport, I think it makes a lot more sense. If you're able to deploy these Starfall satellites on Falcon 9 at relatively cheap cost, or Starfall at a larger scale, and then deorbit them wherever you need on the Earth, that's a pretty interesting logistics capability. And I think, this is a market we've talked about a lot. We've interviewed Space Phoenix Systems about their in-space manufacturing endeavors. This market is projected to be quite large, given that the materials you can manufacture on orbit are very valuable, but being able to do it cost efficiently and regulatorily has kind of been the hurdle. So I think SpaceX is able to clear both those hurdles, and this FAA approval is kind of the first step to actually seeing that manifest.
I'm reminded of
James Bond reference.
No, it's not a James Bond reference. I'm reminded of Jeff Goldblum's character in The Flea, who he invents teleportation for non-organic material and views himself as a failure because he can't teleport people. And it's like, because there's no use for just being able to teleport faster than anything else on the world, just being able to teleport cargo or like raw material. Yeah. There's no applicable use for it.
Yeah, watch out, Jeff Bezos. We're going to get less than a day delivery from SpaceX.
Yeah, right? So
deorbited straight to your doorstep.
I think we'll start to see some SpaceX branded roofing companies crop up in that scenario.
Yeah, what was that Tesla rooftop project like a decade ago?
Oh yeah.
Now,
yeah.
And some kind of adjacent news to SpaceX, there's a few companies that have made announcements kind of coming out of SpaceX discontinuing their transporter program. So transporter is the rideshare program that the Falcon 9 uses to carry a lot of smaller space companies up to orbit. It's been a very successful but not quite profitable business for SpaceX. Or even though it turns a profit, it's a lot more effort to manifest tens of satellites from a number of different companies than it is to manifest a couple of satellites from one company, which is where a majority of their Falcon 9 launches go to, is dedicated launch capabilities. So in the lead up to the IPO, in their transition over to Starship, they've kind of discontinued that transporter program for the foreseeable future. You can't book anything sooner than 2029, and everything up till then is booked out. So it's all waitlisted, which is it's not great for the space industry. A lot of space companies rely on that to kind of prove out their technology in a cost efficient way. But to kind of get around this problem, a couple of companies have stepped up. Companies that have done this for a while, like Exolaunch is a very renowned launch integrator for many companies. You'll see them plastered all up and down the transporter missions because they provide deployment mechanisms for both ESPA-class satellites as well as CubeSat deployers. And they handle a lot of the licensing, integration, communication with SpaceX, program management features for getting your spacecraft onto a rocket. So they bought a dedicated rocket from Falcon 9, as well as CEOPS, which is another company that provides a similar service. And they're taking those dedicated rocket launches and splitting up into pieces that they can use in transporter style missions. So really neat. I think it's filling a gap that SpaceX formed. I think it benefits both companies. I think SpaceX still gets to sell their rockets. They don't have the headache of integrating I think this is an inversion of what we saw about a decade ago when spaceflight kind of lost their business because SpaceX decided to kind of do this for them, like integration level services. But by stepping back from that, I think SpaceX is giving a huge boost to these companies like Xlaunch and SeaOps. And honestly, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's just a lot of work for SpaceX, something that's not easily automated, requires a lot of headcount to do. But it's still something like I would think they'd want to do and is important to the industry. And so having this kind of partnership in this style, I think works best for all parties. On the space side of SpaceX technology, StarCloud has announced that they plan to use 50 plus Starlink mini laser terminals across 25 of their StarCloud satellites. So StarCloud manufactures and operates space data centers. They've launched one before with the HS-100 GPU on board, so they are technically operating on-orbit data center, although they plan to scale up much larger. They've raised hundreds of millions in the past couple of months to scale out to that size. They've filed for 88,000 satellites, but it sounds like this is kind of their first tranche, so to speak, of satellites. So 25 satellites is a good amount to put up. I would assume they'd all go in the same orbit if they're trying to communicate like this, because these Starlink laser terminals are able to communicate about 44,000 kilometers at about 25 gigabits per second. This is an interesting development because laser terminals haven't been commercially sold by SpaceX to other companies, except in the case of Muon. So Muon is the only other company known to be using these terminals, but StarCloud joins that. It's still not clear how you go about getting these. I guess just have good relationships with SpaceX. But it is an interesting capability because, as we just talked about, space-to-space laser communication is a developing technology, but it's one that's in high demand. And a lot of that struggle of scaling it out has been manufacturing throughput. Like that's why we saw Rocket Lab buy Minar, because they needed to be able to control the supply chain in order to get enough components for this. Likely StarCloud, being a new, smaller company with plenty of funding, would hit that same bottleneck. But by partnering with SpaceX to source their laser terminals, they get to immediately tap into an already deployed network of communication satellites, which I think also makes sense why they're stating that they're going to have 2 laser terminals per satellite. Normally, when you use laser terminals, you need at least 3 to 4 in order to provide a mesh. You can't have less than 3 satellite nodes in order to create a mesh, but 2 allows you to connect into an already existing mesh network and create that bidirectional communication. So to me, this reads a lot like StarCloud is being able to focus on just getting GPUs to space and then plug into the existing Starlink network to provide that communication layer that connects them back to the Earth.
On to some of the business moves this week here. Like we alluded to earlier, NASA has awarded 4 major lunar contracts. They include roughly $219 million for Astrolab's rover, $220 million for Lunar Outpost's rover, and $188 million with an option for an additional $280 million extension for Blue Origin's lander. Firefly has additionally won a $75 million subcontract from JPL for the Elytra Dark Orbital Swarm. It's a swarm of drones that are going to be deployed at 50-kilometer altitude to map the moon in great detail. There's also, in that same announcement, there's some potential for an astrobotic mission as well. And while Intuitive Machines was not explicitly awarded contracts in the announcement, they remain one of the key contributors with a Moonbase 3 mission that's scheduled for later this year. Moonbase 1 is supposed to go up in fall of 2026, and Moonbase 2 and 3 are both supposed to follow that mission within by the end of the calendar year as well. But Intuitive Machines remains sort of a key contributor for Moonbase 3, explicitly citing the use of their Nova C Trinity lunar lander for that mission as well. So a lot of big announcements out of NASA over the weekend.
Yeah, this is an interesting one to break down. The rover's cool. I don't know if I have much to say there other than Lunar Outpost just got their, I think, $60 million round of funding last week, likely in anticipation of winning this contract. I thought that was kind of interesting because recently we've been seeing funding raises following contract announcements. So to me, this reads like there's a certain level of investor confidence in this company being able to execute on these. And likely from the demand for lunar capabilities that's expanding rapidly right now.
Right.
The more interesting one to me is the landers, because that's a component of our moon-based aspirations that's been mired in controversy for, gosh, almost a decade now. I think like 6-7 years ago was when they opened up the lunar lander competition, and it was awarded to everybody but like Dynetics and Blue Origin. And then Blue Origin lobbied Congress, and they added like extra budget allocation to NASA and dictated that it had to go to Blue Origin. So they basically lobbied their way into this program with their Blue Moon lander.
We were partnered with Dynetics, weren't we?
Yeah. Maxar was bidding with Dynetics to try to get on as well, but they didn't. And now I guess they kind of do, because they're part of Intuitive Machines, but Intuitive Machines didn't win under this contract, which is the other interesting thing, because like Intuitive Machines had IM-1 and IM-2 and both failed to land on the moon. So part of me thinks that they didn't get awarded this particular contract given their track record. The other part of me thinks that's probably not a good argument, seeing as how they have the most heritage out of any of these companies in trying to land a lander.
Right.
So that seems like a boon. But it also might just be that they don't have the scale of lander that Blue Moon does for Blue Origin. And the one not mentioned here is the Starship Moon lander, which is kind of outside this contract mechanism, but they're still being funded through NASA to develop lunar lander capabilities through Starship. Earlier in the year, we had NASA kind of chastising them for falling behind on their schedule. And since then, we've seen them refocus on the moon over Mars and pick up that schedule. We saw the Starship V3 launch, which is the anticipation of that capability, and a huge step forward. And I think is an interesting juxtaposition against what we saw this week with New Glenn. That NG4 explosion also sets back Blue Moon. That was supposed to be their next mission after the Leo launch. It was supposed to go up later this year, but now it's going to definitely get pushed back to next year, which further risks this NASA program schedule, which is not great for Isaacman. I know he's been pushing very hard to try to ramp stuff up, speed things up. It is good for SpaceX. Now they've kind of gotten themselves some breathing room to get their lunar lander operational first. Although they kind of play in two different domains of what capability they can offer. But it's a very interesting kind of competition between these three lander capabilities to see kind of who will provide the first operational supply there first. It is interesting to see that Firefly didn't win anything for their lander, seeing as how they are the only commercial company to actually successfully land a lander on the moon with Blue Ghost. They did win this very interesting contract. The $75 million for the Elytra Dark Orbiter Swarm is something like I've never seen. I didn't see any indications that this was like a key component, although we've started seeing weirder moon missions recently with things like the Lasso LLO or orbiters, and we have the Omega Prime SDA spacecraft going up. We have the nuclear kind of outpost that's supposed to go up. So this one kind of is fitting into NASA being weirder about some of their space missions. This swarm of orbiters actually deploys drones from 50 kilometers, and they're like literal like drones, like propeller drones that descend to the surface of the moon in order to kind of like fly around on the moon and map out craters for better planning of like where to land and where to place moon bases and stuff. It reminds me a lot of that Mars mission that had a rover attached to their, or a drone attached to the rover, and kind of expanded the capability there. So I think that this is them kind of developing those two in parallel for the moon, and then maybe we'll see future versions of these rovers carrying some of these Firefly drones, or potentially have Blue Ghost's next mission carry some of these drones.
I think I agree with that sort of assessment of what we're seeing out of the contracts. It's so weird to me that neither Intuitive Machines nor Firefly are explicitly called out in the lander contracts here, given that like Firefly is the only one to have successfully done so, and Intuitive Machines has the most shots on goal at doing so, and like neither of them are specifically called out here.
Yeah,
like the timeline, just the ability to actually deliver at the timeline that Isaacman is pushing for means that Blue Origin is almost wholeheartedly going to have to be like, if they want to deliver on time, they're not going to be able to go with Blue Origin for this. And so like whether that means that they do sort of push things out and whether that schedule does slip or whether they stick to the schedule and they try to find somebody else to fulfill the role and then they sort of like repurpose Blue Origin's contract to a later date. Like however they try to sort of stick the landing and thread the needle here, it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, some very I don't want to say odd, but certainly interesting decisions given some of the track records that we've seen from folks.
Yeah, and it's not even Blue Origin's real lander. It's their Blue Moon Mark 1. So it's just like a stripped down version to test out their capabilities. So they're even further behind than the schedule would suggest.
No, I'm not going to make the shift.
They'll land on the moon once in a blue moon.
That wasn't the joke. That's far too funny for anything I had in mind. I'm not going to beat that. Future Corp Space Acquisition 1 has announced a $200 million IPO to pursue defense manufacturing or a launch company to take public. It's a SPAC. This is an additional SPAC play that we're seeing focused on the space industry. This is not the first SPAC that we've seen this year. And I'd be surprised, I'd be astonished if this were the last. There is a lot of money going into space, and SpaceX's IPO is only going to increase hype. Even if SpaceX IPOs for a paltry 1.5 trillion US, that's still going to absolutely juice any and all sort of returns, any and all sort of liquidation. That's going back into the market here. There's going to be a whole hell of a lot of money, a whole heck of a lot of money that is flowing right back into the industry. So I'd be astonished if we didn't see a couple more SPACs. 200 million seems. I'd be very impressed if Future Corp Space Acquisition 1 were able to actually take a launch company private with $200 million. Do
you have any guesses? My guess is Phantom Space, but I also feel like that's too small a number.
200 million. Unless they're gonna go in there levered to the hilt with a massive sort of loan, I think they're gonna be hard pressed to find any actual launch company, any actual launch provider for that price point. Maybe
like Crossbow or Via Space. I mean, like Starfighters is technically a launch company. I'm sure they went public for much less.
I guess maybe you know what, you're right. Maybe the problem here is my definition of launch.
Actually, that's an interesting point because like Longshot or Spin Launch or Auriga Space, like they're all technically launch companies, and I'm sure they could be bought for that amount of money.
I would imagine like those were the names. Spin Launch and Auriga were the companies that came to mind when we spoke about launch, but I would imagine that like both of those companies are way too early to try and take public.
Yeah, but so is Starfighters. Like I feel like
Starfighters is not too early. Starfighters is just a small company. Like they've been around for a while. They've been doing this for a while. They're just not a venture scalable company.
I just feel like maybe in this financial environment, they don't really care if the company can succeed. They just care about having a company that can get like lumped in with the rest of the space economy and gain money, and they can like cash out.
Maybe. I mean, if the strategy is not based on any actual sort of operational or execution metrics, if it's just based on the fact of like, hey, rising tide lifts all ships, let's just get in the tide. If that's where they're at, then it could absolutely work. But I don't think that's a particularly sustainable strategy.
No. So, yeah, I mean, given that Gilmore raised over 200 million on the private market, like 200 million is kind of paltry for a rocket company, unless they're either small or they're more of a missile company that can also launch.
I don't know. I think they'll wind up looking at like the fact that they do list launch as the last of the options makes me think that it's like, oh, wouldn't that be cool? And I think what they're actually going to wind up doing is they're actually going to wind up buying a manufacturing play and trying to take that manufacturing play public and sort of sell the pickaxe and shovels.
That's kind of why I think Crossbow, because like they have the big solid rocket motor contract, but they don't have a lot of like momentum yet.
I could see that. I don't know. I think for me, the hardest part to get behind is a company that I think would benefit from going public. And I think that all of the companies that we've discussed are too early to truly benefit from going public. But again, that's not the purpose. The purpose is not to benefit the company. The purpose is for the owner of the SPAC to cash out and make a bunch of money.
You know what the funniest move would be?
What?
Come on, you can guess.
The funniest move here? Just tell me.
You think Astra's too early?
Oh man, I think that joke is too early. I think it's too soon to be making that joke.
Yeah, too early in the morning, right?
Yeah. Astra wishes they could achieve New Glenn's success from last week. Well, hey, while we're joking around and while we're not being serious, space markets emerged from stealth with backing from Coinbase Ventures. They're a commodities futures trading platform for the space industry, which is neat, but I think is a terrible idea for several reasons. The biggest of which is that the definition of commodity doesn't quite apply to space. Commodities are something that are completely undifferentiated and that you can get anywhere, and it doesn't matter where you get it from. And space is still so nascent and so innovative that there's very few things you can argue are actually commoditized. So, we'll see how this plays out. But I think this is more a reflection of. I think this is more akin to poly market or like betting markets than it is to a true value add for the space industry.
You don't want to roll your 401k into helium-3 futures with me?
Well, when you put it like that, I mean, Iron Sky, I remember some of that movie.
Yeah, this is weird. I mean, the space markets. I mean, I just don't see the point either. Like, what was it like? New Connect was the Polish stock market, like weird exchange thing.
Yeah.
So it is interesting to see more unique like markets pop up for the space industry. I don't know if it's a sign of maturity for us.
No, it's not a sign of maturity. It's a sign that we as a society are developing a gambling problem.
Yeah, addicted to gambling.
Like sports betting and prop betting and gambling is everywhere now after it got lobbied and legalized. This is more a reflection of that than it is of anything to do with the merits of commodities trading in space.
Well, when space isn't risky enough on its own and we have to resort to gambling, we've made it.
I think have is the have to, I think is what's doing a lot of work here.
Last for today, we have our One Tech Advance, which is on the side of orbital data centers. There's not a lot of news on it this week, surprisingly. Usually tons every week these days. But the one announcement was coming out of Lone Star Data Holdings. So they do data centers in the truest sense of the word. We've mentioned that a couple times on the podcast. They've flown data storage services to the moon on board Intuitive Machines 1 and 2. They have a contract with Sidus Space to do circumlunar data storage as well. And now they've signed an agreement with Space Solar to host their Star Vault on board a Space Solar satellite. So Space Solar is a space-based solar power company, which I think are really cool. This one has an interesting kind of purpose to it. They're a UK space-based solar power, so they're leveraging a lot of the United Kingdom funding for energy renewability. There's a lot of money kind of flowing in from that specific market, so they're aiming to capitalize on that in particular, which I think is a interesting niche for this sort of technology. I don't quite see how it plays into Starbolt. It reminds me a lot of Aetherflux not being able to decide whether they were a space-based solar power company or orbital data center company. So they decided, screw it, we're both, and also rocket launch company. So interesting partnership. I think it's good for Lone Star. Like, just get their Star Vault and more things. A large part of their argument for their business is that putting data in far off, hard to reach places makes it more secure, which is why all their contracts till now have been on the moon. So putting one around Earth is a bit of a deviation from that and a bit odd to me. I think reading into this a bit more, it plays into the fact that orbital data centers are booming. The AI orbital data centers, the ones that actually do compute on orbit, and potentially they're seeing that, like on Earth, data storage is a key component to AI systems. And so placing more of that into Earth orbit could be of benefit to their business in the near future.
Yeah, I would think that basically all of the technological and business case problems that they've solved in getting data storage on the moon is very much still applicable to something in Leo, MEO, or Geo orbit. And so, like, I think that the use case for having sort of data storage in Leo orbit, if you have a Leo or a close proximity actual compute station, like, that makes a whole lot of sense. And so, like, I certainly don't think that this is a big leap or represents sort of a big step outside of their core product offerings here.
That's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment. Check out our socials and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.